She was supposed to be a quiet fixture in the background. Poised, professional, and barely seen. In just 8 episodes of Star Trek, Grace Lee Whitney left a mark far beyond her screen time. But behind that iconic hairstyle and crisp uniform was a woman breaking apart in silence. Her dismissal from the show didn't follow a slump in ratings or a creative shakeup. It came swiftly without warning, and left her life in pieces. There was no headline explaining what really happened. No spotlight on the decision that changed everything. What followed wasn't just a career setback. It was a descent few knew about. Addiction took hold, grief clouded her days, and isolation wrapped around her like a second skin. She slipped away from the spotlight, from stability, from herself. Her name faded from scripts and credits, replaced by whispers and blank spaces. But this wasn't the end of her story. Not even close. She was counted out, but she wasn't done. Somewhere along the wreckage, a quiet will to return began to rise. It didn't come fast. It didn't come easy. But it came. Before the fanfare, before the redemptive applause, Grace lived in shadows of pain no camera ever captured. She had been abandoned long before she was ever cast. First as a baby, then again as a woman in crisis. The trauma of her childhood never loosened its grip. When the system pushed her out, it didn't just take away a job. It reopened every wound she'd buried. Alone in Los Angeles, she faced streets colder than any set. The uniform was gone, but the fear remained. Still, piece by piece, she started picking herself up. First, through the kindness of old co-stars who remembered more than her lines. Then through the unwavering love of fans who never forgot her name. It wasn't a grand return. There were no spotlights waiting. Just the slow, steady steps of someone finding their way back. Her journey wouldn't erase the pain, but it would prove that survival is its own kind of strength. And for Grace Lee Whitney, strength was never just a role. It became the way forward. Grace Lee Whitney's life didn't unravel all at once. It came apart piece by painful piece. Born as Marianne Chase on the first day of April in 1930, she was abandoned before she ever took her first steps. No father's name on record. No second chances from her birth mother. Adopted by a Detroit couple who gave her a new name and a birthday cake with "No fooling, she's ours" written on it, Grace smiled through it all. But the smile didn't hold for long. At just 7 years old, she learned the truth about her adoption from her new mother. That one moment cracked something inside her, unleashing a wave of confusion, anger, and loneliness she couldn't escape. Sleepwalking, hoarding milk cartons, avoiding birthdays. These were her early coping mechanisms. She began to see herself not as chosen, but as mistaken. At 14, she was already working. Singing on the radio, winning contests, doing 22 shows a week to help support the family that adopted her. At 17, she turned to alcohol to dull what she couldn't say out loud. By 18, she left Detroit behind, chasing a career she hoped would fill the silence inside her. Under the stage name Lee Whitney, she sang alongside legends like Billie Holiday and Spike Jones, learning how to survive in smoky clubs and chaotic studios. Her voice carried her, but so did her strength. She dipped briefly into nursing school, but Hollywood called louder. Broadway came first. Top Banana in 1951 gave her momentum. Hollywood followed, but not the way she imagined. She appeared in over 80 live TV shows, often seen but never heard, passed over in film credits and dismissed as glamorous wallpaper. The roles were shallow, but she kept showing up. She brought depth to scripts that barely offered lines. And finally, in 1966, Gene Roddenberry saw something in her no one else had, a quiet storm beneath the surface. He cast her as Yeoman Janice Rand in Star Trek, a role that blended strength and sensitivity. It was supposed to be her breakthrough. A strong female presence aboard the Enterprise, sharing scenes with Captain Kirk, standing tall in a world of men. But something dark was already unfolding off-screen. A powerful executive invited her to a late-night meeting at Desilu Studios. What happened there would stay locked away for over 30 years. She was sexually assaulted, alone, terrified, and voiceless. No one protected her. No one intervened. Within weeks, she was fired. Not because of ratings, not because of budget cuts, but because she had been violated by someone untouchable. Leonard Nimoy was one of the few she confided in, and his quiet support became one of her only lifelines. But the damage had been done. Her character was quietly removed, with network executives claiming her presence interfered with Kirk's romantic flexibility. Roddenberry tried to salvage her place, offering to change her hairstyle, rework her role, but the decision was final. And with it, her identity fractured again. She hadn't just lost a job. She had been erased. The uniform came off, the cameras stopped rolling, and Grace spiraled into something darker than anyone could see. Her exit from Star Trek marked the beginning of a downward fall that almost claimed her completely. Addiction took hold of her life like a vice. Stripped of her purpose, cut off from the character she had helped create, she wandered through her days like a ghost. Skid Row became her reality, a harsh, dangerous place for anyone, but especially for a woman still bleeding from unseen wounds. The pain was no longer just emotional. It was physical, constant, inescapable. Her name faded from casting calls, forgotten by an industry that had once applauded her poise. She had nothing left but the ache of what had been taken from her. Years passed in a blur. But then, one small moment shifted everything. DeForest Kelley reached out, reminding her that not everyone had forgotten. That somewhere, fans still remembered. And that somewhere in that memory there might be a way back. Grace Lee Whitney's silence became a cage she lived inside for decades. The assault at Desilu wasn't just a moment. It was a wound that never closed. She never named the executive who hurt her. The fear was too great. The consequences too real. Hollywood didn't protect its wounded. It erased them. Her firing came without explanation, without justice, without warning. The character of Janice Rand had been crafted to balance vulnerability with strength, but in the end, both were used against her. She became collateral damage in a system built to silence victims. The executives called it a creative decision, but she knew the truth. It was an exile. And from that moment on, the descent was relentless. Alcohol numbed the unbearable, but it also fed the void. She lost herself in bottle after bottle, drowning out the echoes of betrayal. The glamour of early fame faded, replaced by blank nights and forgotten days. Roles stopped coming. Friends drifted. She was no longer a rising star, just a woman disappearing one drink at a time. She wandered through the shadows of Los Angeles, hiding from the world that once watched her shine. The streets of Skid Row weren't meant for anyone, let alone someone who had stood beneath studio lights. But there she was, surviving on instinct and scraps, pushing through one painful day into the next. Even in those depths, she carried the weight of what had been stolen from her. Not just the role or the fame, but her voice, her safety, her worth. Few recognized her. Fewer cared. But somewhere within the wreckage, a faint thread of purpose remained. Leonard Nimoy, the man who once played a character of pure logic, extended her something more valuable. Empathy. He stood by her in private, offering support, listening without judgment. He reminded her that her story wasn't finished. Slowly, painfully, she began to climb. Not to a comeback stage or a red carpet, but to a support group. He led her to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, where the truth didn't have to be hidden anymore. The cameras were gone, but healing had a place. In 1976, a quiet reunion would spark the next turning point. EquiCon wasn't a headline event, but for Grace, it was a moment of reckoning. She walked into a convention hall filled with fans who never forgot her. They didn't need an explanation. They welcomed her without conditions. That embrace gave her something more than applause. It gave her a way back. She began speaking at events, connecting with the community that had held her character close for years. But the struggle was far from over. Sobriety didn't arrive overnight. She relapsed, stumbled, fought her way through the haze more than once. Yet each fall came with another hand reaching out. Step by step, she found her footing. The appearances in the Star Trek films during the late 70s and early 80s were not about reclaiming stardom. They were about reclaiming herself. The set had changed. The years had passed. But she walked onto it not as the same woman, but as one still healing, still standing, still here. In 1981, sobriety finally took hold. Not as a victory lap, but as a choice she made every single day. She leaned into faith, not as a magical fix, but as part of her new foundation. A 1984 trip to Israel brought her a spiritual clarity she hadn't expected. But she never claimed it solved everything. She didn't pretend it erased the pain. Grace stayed honest, open, and disciplined, walking the narrow road of recovery with determination. In 1998, She put it all into words. The longest trek wasn't a tell-all. It was a map through darkness. She revealed the assault, the addiction, the loneliness, but she kept the name of the man who hurt her locked away. Some scars were hers alone to carry. Still, her truth resonated. She began sharing her story in churches, prisons, anywhere people were looking for light in their own darkness. This wasn't a perfect return, but it was real. She became more than an actress, more than a former star. She became a survivor who helped others survive. Grace Lee Whitney didn't chase the spotlight anymore. She walked in her own. The same industry that once discarded her quietly watched as she carved out a life on her terms. She kept showing up to conventions, not as a celebrity needing applause, but as a woman whose story now held meaning far beyond the screen. The fans never let her fade. They cheered, not just for Yeoman Rand, but for the woman who fought to be seen and heard again. Her appearances in Star Trek films were never about reclaiming fame. They were moments of quiet defiance. With each return, she reminded the world that she had survived what many wouldn't. Her words carried weight, because they came from lived pain, from days spent forgotten, and from nights that nearly ended her. And yet, there she was, smiling, grounded, and deeply present. The uniform still fit, but it no longer defined her. She had found something greater than a role. She had found herself. She used that platform not to relive her past, but to help others face theirs. Grace spoke in churches, in prisons, in meeting halls filled with stories like her own. She didn't preach. She told the truth. With every word, she reached people others had stopped seeing. Her story became a mirror for those buried under shame, silence, or struggle. The woman who once sleepwalked through childhood now stood awake in every moment. Sobriety gave her consistency. Faith gave her purpose. But honesty gave her peace. She stayed the course, even when it was hard. She stayed quiet when it was painful. And she stayed kind when she had every reason not to be. Her message was never wrapped in perfection. It was wrapped in scars. And those scars connected her to a wider world than any script ever could. Her memoir, The Longest Trek, didn't glorify the pain. It acknowledged it. It lived alongside it. She made the choice not to name the man who hurt her, not because she was afraid anymore, but because her healing didn't depend on revenge. She let her story stand as proof of what she endured, what she rebuilt, what she refused to let destroy her. By the time she published her book, she wasn't looking for attention. She was offering something more valuable: permission for others to speak, to heal, to begin again. She remained active in the fan community until the end. She never turned away from the past. She faced it. She owned it. And she rewrote its ending through how she lived, not just what she had survived. Her legacy was no longer about 8 episodes. It was about everything that came after. Grace Lee Whitney's story didn't follow the arc of a typical comeback. There were no sweeping moments of vindication, no grand finales. But what she created was deeper. She found her way back, step by quiet step. From rejection to reconnection. From trauma to truth. From silence to voice. The woman who once felt like a forgotten child became a source of strength for people far beyond the world of television. She gave back what the world almost took from her: hope. She was counted out. But she wasn't done. And in the end, her most lasting role wasn't one written by a screenwriter. It was the one she wrote herself. A survivor. A guide. A presence that never gave in.